Dr. Simmons, please.
Well, ditto, what she said, and that was the more sedate version of your talk, yeah? That was the calmer.
You didn't think that
more-
was?
I thought, yeah.
We've seen it, that actually was.
Yeah. So let me put a national perspective on what was just described through the experience of myself and my colleagues at the Annenberg Institute and several others. Shortly after the hurricane, many people in the black community who returned or who had stayed understood that their schools were being transformed. There was a Bring New Orleans Back committee established by the mayor and the governor, and there were major foundations and national experts who were descending on New Orleans because they saw it, quite frankly, as an opportunity to implement a vision and a set of values and establish a proof point that would echo throughout the country. And to that extent, you know, the New Orleans reform has been very successful. Efforts to do New Orleans have been tried in Philadelphia and in Detroit and in New York City and in Nashville and in other places based on the success of the reform effort in New Orleans. Nonetheless, you have to understand the enormous devastation and desperation of people in New Orleans at that time, and their thirst for any kind of support in transforming their schools. And so people in desperate circumstances, out of their desperation, open themselves up to support of almost any kind. And I saw that happening in New Orleans. And a colleague of mine, Lisa Delpit, created a coalition, an informal coalition called NAKINO, a horrible acronym, National Coalition for Quality Education in New Orleans. Academics are good at bad acronyms. And my colleagues at the Annenberg Institute and Pedro Noguera and Teresa Perry and Charles Payne and a host of others operating on our own resources, you know, in comparison to the millions of dollars that consultants and foundations poured into the elite planning effort. The grassroots consultants, as we called ourselves, were down there on our own dime, meeting with community members who were hopeful that the reforms would produce change, additional resources, attention that had been absent for years. The black and brown and progressive white colleagues who were part of NAKINO, actually, we wrote a report in 2006, you know, that I urge you all to read. Because the report in 2006 anticipated the challenges of 2015, right? And so I'm going to say a few things from this report. It's not that we were prescient. It's just that the black and brown and progressive white colleagues who were looking at the portfolio model as a basic architecture understood that for that architecture to work, it had to be animated by a set of values that emanated from the people in New Orleans. And the people in New Orleans turned to us to articulate that for them. And we argued at that time that any reform effort in New Orleans would have to be informed by three overarching principles. Not just excellence, but equity and community, right? That is to say that, as the previous speaker so eloquently and passionately stated, schools have always existed not simply to educate individuals, but to strengthen families and communities, not just to prepare a workforce and to strengthen an economy, but to revitalize moral, spiritual, and cultural life in communities across generations and to inform growth and development, right? And in our observation of the recommendations of the B&OB committee, they were high on the issue of excellence in a technical sense, but minimal reference to the issue of equity, a minimal reference to supporting the community and its redevelopment and growth, respecting and honoring the unique culture of New Orleans, and dealing with the fundamental issues of equity. Some communities were impacted more than others. How does the city and community of New Orleans reallocate the resources so that all communities, families, and students have the ability to thrive, not just some? Huh? And so I urge you to take a look at that, because as ad hoc as we were, I was surprised at the attention we received because we were a potential threat. Right? I mean, that's what's always amazing. A group of 12 people coming down on their own dime. Most of the hotels weren't really refurbished at the time, so we were, I was about to say shacking up. That has different implications. We were bunking with different families and communities, and we put together a 10-piece, treatise that basically said portfolio systems aren't bad if they attend to these sets of values, and if they take a cross-sector approach to the redevelopment of New Orleans, which is to say, it's a city that not only had its school system devastated, but homes, the spiritual community, the higher education community, the economy, all of that was devastated. That in order to rebuild the schools, they had to be rebuilt in conjunction with and in alignment with redevelopment efforts in other sectors. And that was the other criticism of the B&OB plan and the subsequent reform plans and implementation strategies in New Orleans, is that they have proceeded without considering the need for support for families in a variety of different ways: healthcare, economic development, housing, transportation, in order to ensure that there's an equitable approach to education. Not simply redesigning schools and informing the talent development strategies and the curriculum, but how do you ensure adequate healthcare, transportation, et cetera. Now, I want to contrast, our emphasis in the Keno group to the issue of community and equity and excellence to the 7 principles of the portfolio strategy as articulated by the Center for Reinventing Education, many of whom are respected colleagues of mine. Right? But their 7 principles, many of which have informed the work in New Orleans, well, I'll let them speak for themselves, and you can have a conversation about what's absent in those principles. One of the elements, good options and choices for families. I like that. You like that?
Sounds good.
We should all should. Good options and choices for families. But in order to exercise options and choices, there are a range of supports we need, right? Healthcare, housing, daycare, preschool, a whole range of things are important in exercising options and choices beyond the availability of good schools, right? School autonomy, a high-order principle for the Center for Reinventing Education. But think about a system that has been devastated, right? Devastated. Teachers are dislocated. School buildings are damaged, right? Communities are flooded. Housing is flooded. And your first priority, one of your first priorities would be school autonomy, right? Right? You have a disaster in your neighborhood. The way to get out of that disaster is for each of you to have the autonomy to redevelop yourselves. That's the time in which community is most important, right? Because that's the time when we have to come together as schools, as advocates, as people of faith, to work together. But school autonomy is one of the primary principles. The fundamental belief of school autonomy, it follows the narrative that our current problems in education in this country are the result of bad teachers, bad schools and broken systems. That is a compelling narrative because all of us have an example of a bad teacher, a bad school, and unfortunately, in many of our systems, we've made the system, the evil enemy. Even those of us who are progressive look at the system as an evil entity that has to be controlled or eliminated. Those bureaucrats. It resonates with the anti-government ethos of conservative politicians, right? And so, bad teachers, bad schools, and broken systems can easily lead to a set of design principles and elements that emphasize autonomy, pupil-based funding. In other words, money should follow the kid, right? What the vehicle for that is not clear, particularly in a destroyed system. How do you go to school for 3 months, decide you want to go to another school, and how much money do you have left that you can take to the other school, and how does that transfer? What are the sunk costs? In a system that's broken, how's that all managed? Talent-seeking strategy sounds like a radar system that will do some damage to people. But I think what that means is ensuring that you have high-quality teachers in schools, right? Again, that was a strategy that assumed that the vast majority of teachers and teacher training institutions in New Orleans were inept and incompetent. Right? And needed to be replaced by outsiders. Right? Again, a slap in the face of a community seeking to recover, and a slap in the face of a fundamental role that education has played, which has been as a stepladder for entry into the black middle class and beyond. Right? So it's a total denigration of the important role education systems place in strengthening families and communities along with students. And so having a talent-seeking strategy that bypassed and essentially denigrated local human capital, if you will, was extremely problematic at a time when people were struggling to rebuild their lives. Right? I mean, think about trying to rebuild your lives and you show up and you are fired en masse, right? And you have been the primary capital, social, cultural, and educational, intellectual, over the years for the system, and now you find yourself replaced at a time when you're also struggling to rebuild your lives. That was one of the most deeply inhumane things I think I saw happen during that period. And then there's the issue of performance-based accountability, and my problem with the enactment of accountability in this instance is it's primarily a top-down model and based on a narrow set of indicators, standardized test scores, a state exam, which is one of the, let's say, poorest quality exam in terms of standards in the nation, perhaps a little bit better than Mississippi. Thank God for Mississippi in some ways. But again, having a accountability system that uses a single indicator that is test-based ignores the broader role and purposes of school, not just academic enrichment, but cognitive enrichment, social emotional development, critical thinking skills, a whole host of things that children in New Orleans and other parts of the country need that aren't measured by and therefore weighed and valued by the particular educational system that is being designed and implemented. And then the final piece there is extensive public engagement. Right? I looked at that and I said, well, gee, there it is, right? But you can define public engagement in very different kinds of ways. And Howard Fuller and I don't agree on a lot. I respect him immensely. He's powerful and passionate. We see the same problem. We just have very different solutions to that same problem. But one thing that we do agree on, and he made this statement at the recent conference that Doug, your organization, convened, was that even though he is supportive of many of the elements of reform in New Orleans, the fact that the community was surveyed and focus grouped as their form of community engagement displaced them as people who were engaged in decision making, having the role of making decisions that reflect the kind of vision and values that the community has, as opposed to voting yea or nay on a reform model largely informed by people from the outside. So I think one of the most important lessons, and I'm being mindful of time, because once I start going, I just start going. I don't even know, I'm like at 10, I'm talking at 10% of what I was supposed to be saying, but we'll have conversation. So one of the things the tasks that we have, both in New Orleans and nationally, as we go forward, rather than critique the past endlessly, we have to set the vision for the future.
That's right.
Right? And the vision for the future can't simply be a technical model. What does a good school look like? Right? What does a system look like? The answer to that question isn't simply grounded in scientific evidence-based research. Right? Mm-hmm. It's grounded in the kind of vision and values that we apply to select our evidence-based models.
That's right.
Right? And what we have neglected and not paid sufficient attention to are the vision and values that reformers are using to decide which models are appropriate and which ones are inappropriate. In New Orleans, we paid scant attention to the fact that the vision and values of the portfolio strategy that was implemented in New Orleans had little to say about equity, had little to say about community, had little to say about culture, had little to say about respecting the history and the historical cultural narratives of the people of New Orleans. And as a result of accepting a model, we bought unknowingly the vision and values that went along with it that actually moved the reform in directions that people didn't anticipate and are struggling with today. So I'd say that one of the things I'm doing with my colleague Beth Glenn and others in the Education Justice Network and with the New Models Working Group and the Convergence Institute and others is paying attention nationally and locally to our need to construct a new set of values that inform the design of our education systems going forward, and ensuring that all of the voices of not only stakeholders, but the citizens of the communities are at the table when these values are constructed and the model is designed. I think one of the most powerful things, and then I'm going to stop, said at the conference that you convened was a question I got from the audience. I don't know, was the audience present or someone that texted the question in, was what would a portfolio system look like if it addressed issues of poverty?
Oh.
What would a portfolio system look like if it fostered racial integration? Right? None of that is on these 7 elements. Right? Integration is an important value. Poverty is an important challenge, right? It's the only thing that's in these values and these sets of design principles has something to do with teaching and learning in the confines of a school building, right? The other issue to raise is, well, what if our vision of learning goes well beyond performance on standardized tests, right? What if our vision of learning has a lot more to do with the concepts of deeper learning or connected learning that are out in the land today, right? Then we would think about not only the education supports we need in schools, but the education supports we need in families and communities, because any child that goes from basic to beyond basic to proficient and advanced, there's a lot of their learning and work outside the schools, in churches, synagogues, mosques, in recreation centers, and coaches and playgrounds. There are a whole range of people that participate in our education in addition to our teachers, right? Older siblings, younger siblings. And the reason why privileged people work so hard to place their kids in certain schools and to move in certain communities is they're aware of the ecosystem that's necessary to support higher levels of learning and growth. Right? So I'll close by saying, that going forward, we have to think about this larger ecosystem that's necessary. Going forward, we have to have a set of values and a vision that animate reform, that address issues of equity, that make poverty not an excuse, but a reality that people have to contend with in order to grow and develop, and to return community to the center of our educational enterprise, not something that kids have to be educated to escape from, right? And I grew up in a generation where Unfortunately, part of our education strategy, and I'm 64 years old, by the way, so I'm a child of the early efforts of integration, right, in schools. And what they succeeded in doing was getting a number of people like myself out of our communities. And so lots of my colleagues of my generation have been successful beyond our dreams, lawyers, PhDs. What we realized is they didn't provide a pathway back into our community to use our resources to strengthen them. And so East Harlem and South Side of Chicago continued to deteriorate despite our success. That means we had an education strategy that was not linked to economic, community, and family development. And the consequences for that in Chicago and in Philadelphia, New York City, continue to be felt today. So our task, ladies and gentlemen, going forward is not to necessarily decry what was done. We can critique it, but critique it not to stop it, but to redesign, inform, and assume our natural role as partners in this reform effort, not simply clients.
Thank you, Dr. Simmons. Thank you.